Good morning, and welcome to day 105 of F260 at First Baptist Meridian. Today we look at 2 Kings 5 through 6:23 as we continue with the ministry of Elijah's successor, Elisha. And just as water had an important role in Elisha receiving his ministry, you will continue to see in today's passages that water continues to have an operative role as Elisha conducts his ministry. The surprising thing about Elisha, however, is the same surprising thing that we find about Jesus in the New Testament, and it's somewhat typical to prophets in general. It's that prophets often say the thing you don't expect to the people you do, and they often say the thing you do expect to the people you don't. And by that I mean that when we see a prophet of God sent to the people of God for the purposes of God, we often expect them to have happy-go-lucky, grace-filled messages for those within the covenant. We often expect them to have words of condemnation and judgment for those outside of the covenant. However, we see biblically, time and time again, that God's highest standard is always for those who claim to know Him best. So often when a prophet is dealing with people that you do expect, his fellow Israelites, there are words of accountability. And often when a prophet is dealing with people you don't expect, such as this Syrian or Aramean general by the name of Naaman, such as the Aramean soldiers in the battle story in 2 Kings chapter 6, there are surprisingly words of grace rather than judgment. This is what we find in the New Testament with Jesus, right? The problem isn't what he was saying. They were not opposed to grace. They were opposed to grace to tax collectors and sinners, which is why Jesus' chief opposition came from scribes, Sadducees, Pharisees, and other religious leaders. So in these Elisha stories, you have this interesting contrast because in the first story of today's reading, he ends up having an audience with the Syrian general by the name of Naaman. And this is a general representing a people who are in active conflict with Israel. And yet, Elisha is willing to heal this man. And interestingly, how does he heal them? He has him dip in the waters of the Jordan River. So far, the Jordan River has been associated almost exclusively with God's people. This is the river that they crossed coming into the land, right? This is the river in which Elisha himself stood to receive the mantle of prophecy from his predecessor, Elijah. And yet God is willing to use the same source to bless those outside and seemingly beyond Israel. Interestingly, Naaman responds wonderfully. He tries, he's so blessed by this, he tries to unload riches and honor on Elisha, and Elisha will not take it. But the unexpected part of the story is that Elisha's servant Gehazi gets greedy, and he does want to take it. And so he goes back under false premises and tries to get this money from Naaman, who gives him even more, right? And then at the end of the story, it is Gehazi who is afflicted with Naaman's original skin condition. The prophet says the thing you don't expect to the people you do, and the thing you do expect to the person or people that you don't. You see this continue into chapter 6. We're not going to touch on the axe head story. I want to touch on this battle story because you feel like on the beginning you almost have something that's mirroring the siege of Jericho, right? Israel is surrounded by enemies. Elijah is confident because he sees that the Lord has all these chariots of fires on the surrounding mountains, and he prays for God to open the eyes of the king. But what happens in the battle? It's not the wholesale slaughter of the enemies. What do they ultimately do? They take prisoners of war in the wilderness, and they do what? Feed them bread and water. So both with the Naaman story and the story of the Aramean soldiers in chapter 6, by the way, those soldiers were from the same nation that Naaman had come from. You have little stories that remind you of God's provision of food, water, and the Jordan River. What does this remind us of? He's treating nations outside of Israel much like he had treated Israel itself. And so these are not standalone stories. There's a bigger theological point here. Israel was always supposed to be a window, a staging point of what God wanted to do for the world as a whole, right? And the sad thing is that when Israel has turned from the covenant, when it's committing idolatry, when it's acting like all the other nations, they are failing to fulfill their role to be a light to the nations. Don't miss it. We talked about in previous videos the Elijah-Elisha relationship looking like Jesus and John the Baptist. What happens? John the Baptist has a ministry that is almost exclusively to his fellow Israelites, and it's one of judgment and accountability. Jesus shifts from not only holding his fellow Israelites accountable, but to extending grace to those seemingly on the outside. And how does Jesus end his ministry, at least in the Gospel of Matthew? Therefore, as you go, make disciples of Panta Ta Ethna, all the nations, baptizing them, water in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I will be with you always to the very end of the age. It's about experiencing grace and not being a container for it, but being a conduit to getting the goodness of God beyond the walls, beyond the boundaries, to the ends of the earth. You see, again, foretaste of that with Elisha that's ultimately fulfilled in Jesus in the New Testament. We could say so much more, but we're out of time. So keep reading, reflecting, and responding, and I'll see you next week. God bless.